Hello everybody, my name is Ilan Pappe and I speak to you from the north of Israel and Palestine. I teach, as some of you may know, at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. I would like in the next 10 minutes to provide a historical context for the present carnage in Gaza, one that counters the historical narrative that has been produced by Israel and is being accepted, it seems, still by the mainstream media in the West, by the political leaderships there and by some sections of the mainstream academia. In order to counter this narrative, one has to look at two historical backgrounds that would enable us to contextualize the present wave of violence in a wider and more appropriate context. The more immediate and relevant past goes back to April and May this year. In those months, it became clear that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has decided to abandon, at least temporarily, its full support for the failed diplomatic process based on the Oslo Accord principles, and not to be captivated anymore within the discourse and demands of the American peace initiative and the quartet's principles for a solution in Israel and Palestine. Instead of participating again in a futile round of talks, the Palestinian Authority has decided to try and form once more a unity government with Hamas, and decided to go unilaterally to the United Nations and other international organizations in order to demand their attention and their reference to the situation in Palestine on the basis of a human rights and civil rights agenda, and judge Israel according to these yardsticks, and not to accept the paradigm of parity that claims that there are two conflicting parties that need international mediation, but rather an oppressed party that needs world's assistance. This initiative was regarded by Israel as a very dangerous development. And when Israel is faced with dangerous developments in its eyes, it uses all its military might. And we know it is the strongest military power in the Middle East. It is not using it this time against divisions of tanks, conventional armies or non-conventional armies, but against mainly civilian population that has very little means to defend itself. Israel was looking for a pretext to launch its initiative to destroy these new moves and ploys by the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The pretext was the abduction and killing of 3 young settlers by local Palestinian youth who were infuriated by a systematic killing of young Palestinians by the Israeli army in the month of April and May 2014. This local initiative had nothing to do with the Hamas, but it was enough for Israel to launch a military assault on the Hamas in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The political leadership and activists of the Hamas in the West Bank were arrested, including members of parliament, ministers, and political prisoners who were released in the famous Shalit exchange deal. Israel waited for a Hamas reaction. A mild Hamas reaction came with the firing of a few rockets that did not hurt anyone. But this was enough for Israel to take the initiative further and use military might that is aimed to defeat conventional armies of states and not an urban society crammed into one of the world's most densely populated area at the size of a middle city in the United States. But there's a wider historical context for what I termed elsewhere the genocidal policies of Israel against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The wider historical perspective takes us back to 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Immediately after the occupation, the 13th government of Israel, which was the most consensual government Israel ever had and would have, every shade of the Zionist political system was represented in that government, took several decisions that are relevant to what's going on today. The first decision was not to expel the 1.5 million Palestinians that lived in the areas Israel occupied in 1967. Israel wanted to keep the territories, but of course did not want to include the Palestinians in it in the demographic balance in order to maintain the Zionist vision of having a Jewish state, but also a democratic one. In 1948, in order to achieve that vision, Israel expelled almost 1 million Palestinians, and only then had elections, democratic elections, to find out what the majority of the people wanted after the majority of the people were actually expelled. In 1967, it was decided not to do that again because of world public opinion, because the army was fatigued, and because it was clear that they would try and expel a population that was already expelled. The second decision was that the territories, that the West Bank in particular, but maybe some also thought in that way of the Gaza Strip, would forever be under Israeli control. That did not mean that Israel should not participate in a peace charade and declare its readiness to negotiate over the West Bank, but in practice all the ministers agreed that Israel should establish irreversible facts on the ground in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip that would retain these 20% of Palestine that Israel failed to occupy in 1948 as part of the future Greater Israel. The third decision was not to grant citizenship to the people who were in a territory that Israel will never give back, but would not be expelled from. And in order to keep them at a citizenless level, they were treated as inmates in a huge prison. And there were two options for these people. A model of an open prison, should they succumb and accept and resign to that fate of being citizenless inmates almost forever. Under Israeli control, they could run their own life, they could have an autonomy, and the open prison could even be called a state at a future stage. It would be a Bantustan, a few Bantustans, with the Palestinian flag waving over them as the best maximum option. Should they resist, and they resisted in Gaza in 1967, they resisted all over the occupied territories in 1987 and in 2000, then Israel would turn the open prison into a mega maximum security prison and would collectively punish it, as it did in 2002, as it does now in Gaza. When Israel punishes, it uses all its military might, F-16s, Merkava tanks, the heaviest artillery possible, and other lethal weapons, the nature of which we know very little about, as they are experimental and are used also in order to show to prospective customers their effectiveness in real battlefield, when the battlefield is a village, usually a town or a city. The West Bank eventually was tamed by Israel, or according to an Israeli perspective, by dividing it into two basic parts, although these parts appear in different forms within the West Bank. There are parts of the West Bank that Israel annexes as we speak and would eventually impose the Israeli law on. This is, of course, strengthened by a constant stream of Jewish settlers ever since 1967 into those parts. There were parts of the West Bank which are densely populated by the Palestinians that Israel does not wish to control directly. They could be called a Palestinian state should the Palestinian resign to live in open prison Bantustans forever. This kind of an arrangement was tried in the Gaza Strip. Settlers were invited into the Gaza Strip. 30% of the Gaza Strip was declared as an Israeli Gaza Strip, and the rest as a Gaza Bantustan. But this did not work. The Gaza Strip is too small. It is locked between Egypt and Israel, and there was no way that the wardens of the jail of Gaza, namely the settlers, could live peacefully when the resistance against them started in earnest. And thus Ariel Sharon decided to take out the wardens, the settlers, seal the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and bombard it with all of Israel's might whenever the people of Gaza would not accept the ghettoization that was imposed upon them ever since the settlers in 2005 were taken out. A ghettoization that includes starvation through checking how many calories a Gazan person needs in order to just barely survive, the prohibition of any basic material for normal existence, and of course a total sealing of the strip from any connection with the world. So the Hamas, and before that even secular movements, are trying to resist this ghettoization. And with every resistance, Israel employs more power. Power that every Israeli general knows can only result in a massive killing of civilian population. This exponential killing of civilians in every conventional definition by the United Nations and even by the State Department of the United States can only be described as an act of ethnic cleansing. When one ethnic group uses its military force to eliminate another ethnic group, in this case because it doesn't know what to do with it, then this is a crime against humanity and a genocidal policy. There's very little hope for an Israeli change of mind. The Gaza Strip is in Israel's mind ever since 1967 an area that should somehow disappear out of existence. And when the people in that area remind the Israelis that they are human beings and they would not sit quietly lying down while they are incrementally genocided and strangulated and sieged, then Israel accelerates its killing spray and machine, and the obvious results are unfolding in front of our eyes as we speak. What can be done to stop it? First of all, one has to accept the ideology that lies behind these policies, and the ideology is the same one that informed the Zionist movement in the late 19th century. Israel is a state that wants, that craves to take over as much of historical Palestine as possible, and to have in it as few Palestinians as possible. The means for achieving that vision, so that Israel could be both Jewish and democratic, have changed with time. At present, they mean 3 points. They mean three basic policies: maintaining an apartheid policy inside Israel against the Palestinian minority there, dividing the West Bank into two basic parts of a Jewish and a Palestinian West Bank, enclaving the Palestinians in Bantustans, and slowly transferring them out of the Jewish areas of the West Bank, and finally trying to silence Gaza and send it into oblivion by sieging it and ghettoizing it, with the hope that Israel could forget about it. The fact that the Gazans are not willing to be forgotten pushes Israel to a more extreme means of trying to send Gaza into historical oblivion. And the means are military, and they are financed by your government in the United States, and many of them are produced by the United States. And they will be continued to use, as Israel does not have an alternative policy, and because it is still informed by that ideology I've just described. Recognizing this ideology as a racist ideology, recognizing the political outfits that were built because of that ideology, should be at the heart of the conversation about a solution to the problem in Israel and Palestine. Declaring Zionism as an ideology akin to the ideology that informed the apartheid state in South Africa, and using the same means the international community employed against apartheid South Africa in the case of Israel, can open the way for the discussion of a regime change in Israel that would allow both Israelis and Palestinians not to be governed by an ideology that benefits the one but destroys the other. This will open the door for looking for a different ideological framework, much more moral and ethical, one which is already enjoyed by a lot of people around the world, a genuine democratic ideology that regards every person as equal to another person electorally, democratically, and socially. With this kind of regime intact, the land between the Mediterranean and the sea could be a haven for both the settler communities, now in its third generation, and the indigenous native people of Palestine, who should be joined by all those who were expelled in 1948 during the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe. Accepting the BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanction, as the main means for the international community to pressure Israel into a regime change, and supporting especially non-violent resistance on the ground by the Palestinians with their Israeli comrades, is the only way forward for solving this question by creating an ODS with the help of the BDS, one democratic state with the help of boycott, divestment, sanction, with a genuine Palestinian representation, an authentic Palestinian leadership that would lead us into a much better future. Thank you.